The 1950s saw the introduction of a number of innovative, purebred, all-weather bomber interceptors. These aircraft remain fascinating for their technical ambition and are rightly celebrated. But bringing these aircraft into service took much longer than their buyers expected and their suppliers promised. Faced with a deterrent gap, Air Forces commissioned interim interceptors based on existing day fighters. For a decade, thousands of these largely forgotten aircraft sat on alert, in the hope that their presence would make any nuclear attacker think twice before striking. A while back, I ran a poll asking which one of these planes you'd choose to go up in if the balloon went up in the early 1950s. Your answer was clear. It's the Sabre Dog. Some of your intended tactics were also noteworthy. I believe that the phrase is blaze of glory. Just to add a bit of spice, I'd like to introduce a wild card. You see, it wasn't just NATO that had an interception problem at this time. The MiG-15 proved dangerous to B-29s in Korea. As many as 40 were shot down. That number included 7 or 8 shot down at night. The bombers could be illuminated by radar-directed searchlights or found via the flames shooting from their exhaust pipes, and then they could be attacked by particularly brave and skilled Russian pilots. Impressive though this was, it wasn't a realistic defensive strategy when faced with dozens of attacks from multiple directions involving hundreds of bombers. The PVO's answer to this problem in the 1950s was supposed to be the Su-9 Fishpot, but this aircraft was significantly delayed. The Soviets' interim solution was the MiG-17P and the afterburner-equipped PF, radar-equipped versions of the MiG-17 day fighter. Given the MiG-17's overall performance, maybe it'll give the dogship a run for its money. In this video, I'm going to try and play out a semi-realistic intercept and see what the objectively best interim interceptor was. To do so, we need to set up a scenario. Because of the time of year, we'll make it December the 25th, 1953 at 3 a.m. Santa is going to deliver a nuclear surprise. With that time set, we now need a base. In the F-94 Starfire video, I got some pretty direct feedback about my pronunciation of Spokane, Washington. By way of apology, I did want to base our mission from Geiger Field near the beautiful Lilac City, the home of Father's Day no less. Sadly for this scenario, Geiger isn't realistic. Early warning in 1953 was primarily provided by a line of radar sites called the Pine Tree Line, which ran across southern Canada. Geiger wasn't the primary interceptor base for any of those sites. As part of the expansion of radar sites in North America, it did get a radar site at Mika Peak in 1956. From then on, Geiger Field was the base for the 498th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, flying the F-102 Deuce during the 1950s and into the 1960s. So instead, I'll have to store up more upset by choosing McCord near Seattle for its proximity to the Pine Tree Line radar site at Baldy Hughes. McCord also had its own radar setup, but that won't pick up our intruders until too late. In 1953, the base hosted the 318th Fighter Interceptor Squadron flying the F-94A Starfire, but the 318th moved to Thule in Greenland in June 1953. They must have upset somebody. They were replaced by the 465th Fighter Interceptor Squadron flying the F-86D Sabre Dog. McCord conveniently positions us for intercepting intruders coming down over the pole and through Canadian airspace towards Seattle. Given that I nuked Seattle previously, we will try harder to defend it this time. The weather in the early morning of the 25th was quite cold. 39 Fahrenheit or 4 degrees C if you prefer. There was light drizzle and fog at ground level. A waning gibbous moon lit the scene reasonably well above that fog. Now we need an enemy. Since we have both NATO and Soviet interceptors, it is quite hard to find a realistic target. I must admit to finding it hard to resist the obvious common enemy, Unfortunately, the Sud-Ouest Vautour was more of a late 1950s design and isn't really representative of a strategic bomber threat. It is quite a small aircraft and lacks defensive armament. The US and UK aircraft were essentially designed to combat the Tu-4 Bull and IL-28 Beagle. The MiG-17P was intended to counter the B-29, B-50, and B-36. To make life simple, we could make our target a Tu-4. This guy would run in towards us at 30,000 feet and around 400 miles an hour. But simple is boring. If we stretch things a little, 1953 just about gets us access to the M4 Bison and B-47 Stratojet. These are different aircraft in a lot of aspects, but roughly comparable in that they would run in at around 580 to 600 miles an hour and at 40,000 feet. Let's choose the Bison as it has a wider selection of defensive armament, 6 23mm cannons in 3 turrets. In 1953, it would have carried 2 fission bombs of about 200 kilotons yield. A successful interception mission limits the bomber's penetration of the defenses. That means we need to get airborne as fast as possible and engage it as far away from population centres as possible. Since we are going to scramble at 3 a.m. into a dingy December night, successful engagement means that we must first locate the bombers. We then need to be at the right altitude and relative position to employ our weapons. Now the setup is ready, let's quickly meet the contestants. The detailed videos on each of these are in the show notes. And a quick note, if you have time after watching this one, then 10 minutes watching the Vampire Night Fighter video would make me very happy. It was definitely one for the purists. Anyhow, I've already mentioned the dogship, the F-86D Sabre Dog, a radar and afterburner equipped version of the legendary F-86 Sabre. It has no guns, instead it carries folding fin aircraft rockets in a retractable tray under the nose, cued onto the target by a fiendishly complicated analog computer and autopilot. Next up is the other US interim, the F-94C Starfire. This one is based on the T-33 trainer version of the F-80 Shooting Star. It has straight wings, but a slightly better radar and even more of the same rockets as the Sabre Dog. It also has an afterburner. Crucially, where the Sabre is a single-seat fighter, the Starfire has a dedicated navigator and radar operator. 2 RAF planes complete the NATO set. The Meteor NF-14 is a 2-place version of the classic Meteor day fighter. It has the same radar as the Starfire and Sabre, but does without the computer-controlled automatic firing system and rockets. 20mm cannons in the wings for the Meteor. The interim of interims, the de Havilland Vampire, is the final aircraft in the set. An earlier World War II era radar and the same cannons as the Meteor in a smaller, less powerful, but easy handling package. These 4 and the MiG-17 are sitting out on the taxiway near the runway ready to go. But right now we can relax in the hut at McCord, hoping for a quiet Christmas night. To keep ourselves alert, we can indulge in the stereotypical pick-me-ups of our chosen countries. A strong cup of black coffee, a lovely mug of builder's tea with 8 sugars, half a bottle of premium vodka. Don't get too comfortable. Here we go. Baldy Hughes picks up the bogey at about 175 miles out. There was no coordinated national ground control intercept system in North America at this time, and thus no way to identify harmless civilian aircraft and deconflict the airspace. As I understand the process, the 918th Aircraft Control and Warning Squadron at Baldy Hughes would therefore call up McCord and warn them to stand by. The next step is to identify the aircraft. Visual identification by ground-based spotters is impossible as it is the dead of night and the aircraft is flying over sparsely populated areas. I haven't been able to find information about procedures for nighttime identification in those circumstances. I assume that in this case a flurry of calls to SAC and other air bases in the vicinity would be required in order to ascertain whether they had any aircraft up. The speed of the Bison means that the target would have had to be a military aircraft, as no contemporary civilian aircraft enjoyed that level of performance. Let's be optimistic and assume that this takes 10 minutes. It is all one-to-one telephone calls in the dead of night. I imagine that at this stage, other radars would be picking up unidentified contacts as well. This bogey can be designated a bandit. At this point, the Bison is covering about 10 miles a minute. It is now 75 miles north of Baldy Hughes. McCord receives the order to launch its alert fighters. A klaxon sounds in the alert shack and the pilots dash to their planes. So now we're into the first part of the race. Speed to launch is not just about aircraft performance. The ergonomics of the cockpit play a role, as does the kit the pilots are wearing and the nature of the avionics they need to activate. From an ergonomic perspective, the Starfire had a legendarily terrible rear seat cockpit layout that was difficult to climb into, particularly in a rush. Its crew were also encumbered by their G-suits. The Vampire also suffered from cramped conditions, but this was mostly a factor when flying the plane rather than jumping in. The Meteor, Sabre, and MiG-17 are all excellent ergonomically. Pre-flight startup in the Sabre was a bit longer because of its more complex systems. The MiG didn't really have any systems. If you knew where everything was in the cluttered cockpit, then you could just turn it on and go. So the chances are that the MiG is rolling first, then probably the Meteor, followed by the Sabre, Vampire, and Starfire. The MiG-17 PF absolutely blasts into the air. Its takeoff roll with the afterburner blazing is only a touch over 1,600 feet. Initial climb rate is also stupendous. If the pilot keeps the burner on, he'll be almost 12,000 feet up within the first minute, and he'll be at 40,000 feet in under 7 minutes. The Meteor is much slower. Even with its thick, straight wings, the lack of reheat means that it requires 2,700 feet to get airborne to 50 feet. Initial climb rate is still good though at 7,000 feet per minute, and even at full military power, the absence of afterburners means that the Meteor is far more efficient than the MiG. It is a much better climber than you might expect and will be at 40,000 feet 8 minutes after takeoff. Curiously, a combination of swept wings and high weight means that the Sabre Dog actually requires over 3,500 feet to get off the ground. Once it lifts and gets the gear up, though, it also has the advantage of afterburner power. The initial climb rate is comparable to the MiG-17 at 12,000 feet a minute. Keep the burner on and it'll be at 40,000 feet in 7 minutes and 15 seconds. The Vampire gets airborne at a bit over 120 miles an hour. Like the Meteor, it takes 2,700 feet to lift off, which is very British and sporting. The climb to 40,000 feet will take a leisurely 16 minutes and 20 seconds if the pilot keeps the Goblin all the way to the stops. Despite its slow start, the F-94 also has the advantage of an afterburner. Even so, its nearly 2,800 feet of takeoff roll takes 45 seconds to complete. Once off the ground, the Starfire can also get past 10,000 feet in the first minute, but the Starfire will need to motor if it's going to get into a viable firing position. Fortunately, it too is a fast climber and will polish off the 40,000 feet climb in a touch over 8 minutes. Now that all of the aircraft are up, the Interceptors become the responsibility of McCord Manual Direction Center P4. They'll direct the Interceptors until they have acquired the incoming bombers on their own radars. The Bison is over Baldy Hughes before any of the fighters are at 40,000 feet. The crew manning the radar have no weapons to use against it. Maybe they hear the roar of the engines over the sound of the wind. The MiG-17 is the first one to get to the right altitude, by which point the Bison is 220 miles from Seattle and closing fast. 25 minutes after detection, the fighters are a bit strung out. The MiG is in the lead, closely followed by the Sabre Dog. Afterburners and swept wings are proving to be a powerful combination thus far. But the Meteor is only 15 miles behind. In its era, the Meteor was the fastest climbing twin-seat fighter in the world, and although slower than the two single-seaters, it has only used a fraction of its fuel in getting to this point. The MiG has dumped its now empty drop tanks, having burned through them, and over a third of its internal fuel. Only 20 minutes into the mission, it is already marginal whether the pilot can make it back after the interception is complete. The Sabre Dog is in slightly better shape, but will only have 5 spare minutes to complete the intercept. But that's okay, right? We're now only a matter of 2 minutes away from the contact. Easy street from here. 28 minutes after Santa's Bison was first detected, 4 of the 5 interceptors are preparing to acquire contact on their own internal radars. Suddenly, their radios are jammed up with a mass of static. Contact with ground control is impossible. The quality of their radars and the ability of the crew to use them will be critical in these essential minutes. It is a dark night. Without radar contact, they will have no way of finding the bombers. At this moment, the MiG-17 is 31 miles from the Bison, the Sabre Dog is 33 miles away, the Starfire is 49 miles away, the Meteor 51, the Vampire is 94 miles back and still climbing to altitude, which suggests that the 7% of people who selected it as their ride to defend us against Armageddon may be regretting their choice. With no contact with ground control anymore, the best radar is the AN/APG-40 in the Starfire. With the second crewman in the back, it also has a dedicated person to manage the radar search while the other flies the plane. The Starfire could theoretically detect a bomber flying at identical altitude from 30 miles. At the current rate of closure, it will be in detection range inside a minute. The Meteor and Sabre Dog have broadly similar maximum radar detection ranges at 25 miles, but the former also benefits from a second crewman. The worst radar is in the MiG-17, and it also required the pilot to fly the plane while trying to find the contact. He would be lucky to pick up a bomber at 8 miles and more likely to detect it at 5. That will be a problem as the closure speed of the two aircraft is about a mile every 2.5 seconds. For completeness, the Vampire has a late Second World War vintage radar, being operated by its navigator. But the Vampire is so far behind the others that it will be 5 minutes before it is close enough to begin scanning at its 10-mile range. We now have to make an assumption about the penalty that a single-seat fighter pilot experiences in trying to find a target in the dark. US ADC doctrine insisted on intercepts being trained for with the head in the cockpit, as it were. But this is the dead of night, it's windy and cold at altitude. The pilot also has to try and fly the plane as well as work to find a target on the analog scope. Although he is unlikely to miss by as much as the MiG pilot will, do we believe that the Sabre pilot will be as quick to locate the Bison as the men in the twin-seat fighters? They only need to be about 50 seconds to a minute faster in order to beat him to the punch. My view is that in these conditions, the Sabre pilot is likely to be delayed in setting up his attack by a crucial 1.5 to 2 minutes. The Starfire and Meteor therefore reach the point of engagement first, trailed by the Sabre Dog. As I hinted at, the MiG fails to find the Bison as it makes a devilish 5-degree turn as soon as the jamming commences and stays out of the MiG's detection range. The Starfire has an advantage in this moment as its E5 fire control system can automatically cue the firing of the 2 3/4-inch folding fin rockets that make up its weapon system. The system tells the pilot how to engage. He selects a beam attack and moves onto a parallel course from which he will turn onto the pursuit curve. The Meteor pilot doesn't have an automated system as the US wouldn't sell it to the UK. What happens next is therefore dependent on how brave the pilot is. During the Battle of Britain, a proportion of the RAF pilots developed a penchant for head-on attacks. The Meteor pilot essentially has no choice in this as he lacks the automated pursuit curve function of the Starfire and lacks the performance offset to engage the Bison from the beam or from 6 o'clock low. A beam-on tracking attack is theoretically possible, but it's pretty marginal. Desperate to win the race to save Seattle from nuclear Santa, he therefore sets up for a head-on attack. Although this means that he is going to beat the Starfire to the moment of engagement by about 30 seconds, this attack is going to be fraught with difficulty and danger. He can see his range to target on the radar scope, but there are no cues on his gun sight that reveal where the Bison might be. If he's lucky and the Bison is silhouetted against the moon, then he may be able to commence firing at 2,000 yards. If he isn't, then realistically he'll see the Bison at more like 1,000. That doesn't mean that he can't start firing earlier, but remember that if he has tracers loaded, then he may be blinded by the flash. Assuming that the guns all work, which was never a given, the 420mm Hispano-Suiza cannons each fire 750 rounds a minute. As a battery, they therefore fire 50 20mm rounds a second. Contemporary estimates put the number of 20mm shells needed to down a bomber at between 15 and 20. The Meteor is closing on the Bison at 1,180 miles an hour. That's 577 yards per second. Quite an unusual measurement. But anyway, if he has 2,000 yards of notice and is blessed with outstanding reactions, the most the Meteor pilot will get is a 2-second burst before he needs to take violent evasive action in order to avoid a collision. Let's say that he gets off 100 rounds. Hit rates for RAF pilots firing at bombers in World War II were somewhere around 20%. So it is just about believable that the Meteor pilot would get lucky and score the required hits. It would be a real Christmas present for him, though. More likely, the Bison takes a couple of hits but keeps flying. So that brings the Starfire back into play. Guided by the E5 fire control system, all its pilot has to do is to fly on instruments to the right place. As he approaches the point of intercept, an artificial horizon appears on his scope. At lock-on, a steering dot indicates the azimuth and elevation steering errors. By steering so as to center the dot, the F-94C flew a lead-on collision course with the target. The inner circle served as a reference for centering the dot, and the outer circle indicated the time to go before the rockets would strike the targets. 20 seconds before the rocket's impact, both circles begin to shrink so as to allow more precise steering and to show seconds before the rockets hit. With 4.5 seconds to go, the reference circle flattens into a straight line. This indicated that the computer was controlling the azimuth errors and that the pilot had to correct only for elevation errors. An X appeared when the rockets were fired automatically. Having chosen to fire half of his rockets, 24 2¾ inch rockets are salvo fired in under half a second, giving a throw weight of 127 kilos of projectiles, of which nearly 15 kilos is explosive. Although they get bad press because of the poor accuracy of the systems installed in the Sabre Dog and Scorpion, the Starfire's rocket accuracy was actually quite reasonable due to its closed-back launchers. These concentrate the rocket blast and thus enable the rockets to fly a straighter course to the target than those launched from an open-back launcher. "See ya, Commie Santa," the pilot yells as one of the rockets hits home. The Bison bursts into flames and heads for the deck. In this scenario at least, it was down 90 miles from Seattle, around 32 minutes after it was first detected. Let's hope those nukes stay in one piece. You'll be pleased to know that all of the pilots are able to return to base, although the additional search time required by the Sabre and MiG and the fundamental inefficiency of the Starfire make things a bit dicey. What I think this scenario shows is that even though I was able to be quite kind to the pilots, it is Christmas after all, things were touch and go. This was a simple interception with one fighter and one bomber. A 4-ship would have been more standard at the time, but in truth it probably would have made little difference to the outcome. If there was more than one Bison, then there's a high likelihood that one or more aircraft would have got through. Lack of performance offset means that the fighters have to set up and make their attacks with perfect execution. There's limited time to re-attack. Only the Sabre Dog could realistically catch the Bison for a second pass, although in doing so it would almost certainly run out of fuel. The Vampire was completely useless against this kind of attacker. The Meteor was extremely marginal despite a good radar and its relatively good performance off reheat. Attacking head-on without a radar-directed gun sight just wasn't practical. The MiG was only useful if it could communicate with GCI. However, both the US and the Soviets developed extensive comms jamming gear, so that really was nothing like a given. The MiG was, however, better than nothing for the air arms that the Soviets supplied it to and might have been somewhat useful against lighter bombers. The more specialized interceptor on the US bench was the F-89D Scorpion. This had the option of a head-on pursuit curve and much heavier armament, but once again, lack of offset meant that it was a one-shot weapon, which is probably why they started carrying nuclear-tipped Genie rockets in the J model. The Canadian Canuck was better from a performance and armament perspective, but I would argue still flawed against a fast-moving bomber in that it required excessively precise ground control positioning to execute an intercept. It wasn't until the F-102 Deuce and F-101 Voodoo appeared in the middle 1950s that the US and Canada gained truly reliable protection against high subsonic, high-altitude attack. At which point, of course, the run-in would have probably moved low to also provide protection against Nike Hercules batteries. For a couple of decades, this war of posturing and technology development was the focus of the Cold War. It produced some brilliant ideas and remarkable aircraft. Some of them even might have worked if push had come to shove.